All right, guys. Well, I came to school today, but I have a migraine, so I'm not going to make it. I'm going to do probably the worst video lecture possible. So just bear with me. There's some information that I need to get out of the way today, and then I'll let you have the rest of the time today to either read ahead or get caught up on your reading so that we can kind of fly starting on Monday. And then instead of Friday being a review day when I'm gone, there'll be probably a video or two in terms of lectures to make sure that we've covered the material. We'll still be on track for your test on Tuesday, I think, but we might do a review at the beginning of the hour on Tuesday. So with that said, we're just going to cover the prenatal and toddler stuff right now, possibly the attachment stuff. We'll see how I do. So starting out with developmental psychology, we know that we're talking about basically conception to death and everything in between. There are three key developmental issues that have to be considered. The first one is nature versus nurture. And hopefully by now you guys know what that means. But nature means what are the biological or genetic influences on development, and nurture means what are the environmental influences on development. So maturation is something that they consider as part of this. In psychology, maturation is actually talking about biologically determined changes that happen in a typical sequence. So an example of that would be like motor development. Motor development in babies, so crawling, walking, all of that stuff, typically happens in a certain order around a certain time. So we would talk about maturation as part of that. There's also the question of critical periods, and that can be kind of controversial, but critical periods are looking at, is there a specific time during which something has to develop, a skill has to develop, or you have to be exposed to it, or you can no longer learn it? And we're going to look at that a little bit on the next slide. It's not the best, but what I'm going to have your sub do is pause the video now, pull up my PowerPoint that is on the screen, and I have it set to this particular slide, and they're going to show you the trailer for a movie called Babies. So if your sub could pause the video now and do that, I'll talk about the video after. All right, so isn't that a cute clip? It's actually a cute little movie, but the reason that I show you the trailer there is because it really shows you babies across a variety of different areas. And what they did was they tried to look at what is the nature and what is the nurture. So how are environments different that you saw those babies kind of living in, right? Like goats drinking out of the water dish right next to the baby versus like moms at like playtime with their babies, right? So it's really looking at what's the maturation? What are some of the things that are going to happen regardless of the culture or area that you're in? And then what are some of the things that we need environmental stimulation for? So critical periods then, like I said, is that time where you're set to acquire a certain function, okay? I'm going to have you watch just a tiny little clip in a second here. It's going to be at 46 seconds, and then you're going to watch it until 2 minutes and 45 seconds, so about 2 minutes of the clip. And what it is the case of Jeannie. They called her Jeannie the Wild Child. It's a super disturbing case of a girl that was born and was essentially thrown in her crib when she was big enough to sit up, was actually strapped to her potty chair. She had no interaction with humans other than her father, and her father never spoke to her. He only growled at her or made loud noises. So with that said, again, I'm going to ask the sub to pause the video, go into my PowerPoint, and find the video and pull it up. All right, so I know that was a short little clip, but her case is actually a really sad case, but she's fascinating to psychology, right? Because she's essentially a person who has had no environmental influence at all, because she had no toys in her room to play with. Her room was barren. There weren't even bright colors. She had never heard language or anything like that before. She hadn't been up and walking or anything like that. So you can see the little picture of her in the corner right now, and they called it a bird-like walk. She kind of walked hunched over, but if you think about it, like push her to sitting down, and that's exactly like she was strapped to her potty chair. So anyway, researchers really tried to get her to develop language, and they found that her language development actually kind of maxed out. She never really progressed the way that they thought that she would. And then, just like anything else, all the money that was being poured into her, it kind of like dwindled, and then she ended up in a home for the rest of her life. So her case is a relatively sad one. The next key developmental issue is, let's see if I can make it happen here. There we go. Stability versus change. So with that, they're looking at how consistent are your behaviors over your lifespan. So, and we've talked about this a little bit with personality, right? So if you are super extroverted when you're younger, is that a consistent behavior throughout the rest of your life? So that's obviously a really important issue to research in development, would be stability versus how much you change. And then the final of the three issues is continuity versus stages. And the continuity view says that change is uniform and gradual. So the example that they have is like of a tree, right? Like you plant a tree and it grows, but you don't really realize it growing, right? Like some days you'll be like, oh man, that tree's huge. But you didn't really notice the growth process. So it seemed very continuous. The discontinuity view would be the one that's actually associated with the stage theories that we're going to learn about. And that suggests that change can actually be pretty fast and pretty different, meaning there can be a typical order in which development happens, but there might be a clear indicator that someone has moved into the next stage of development. So a lot of our theories are going to kind of talk about that for you. So this is kind of a summary of the three major issues in psychology, or in developmental psychology. We use different types of methods. You'll do methods with Mr. Ray. Both of these types of research are really important, and you just need to be familiar with them in general right now. Cross-sectional research is where it's like a snapshot in time, but we might grab different age groups and do that snapshot with all of those different age groups at the exact same time. And then longitudinal research is actually where we follow the same group of people, but we follow them sort of throughout their lifespan. So the example on the sheet or on the screen is studying a 20-year-old and then studying them again when they're 40 and then studying them again when they're 60 to try to figure out some aspect of development. All right, so as we move into kind of the prenatal part of this discussion, this is in general the ages that are assigned to each stage, so prenatal, infancy, early childhood, middle, adolescence, young, adulthood, middle adulthood, and later adulthood. So you guys fall into adolescence. Notice young adulthood is like a giant range, so I'm shockingly still in young adulthood. And then middle adulthood, and then you can see that later adulthood, it's funny because that number should probably be adjusted just because people are living longer and retiring later and things like that, but this is still the approximate age that we look at when we study these types of development. So we're going to move into really, really quickly because this is something I kind of expect you guys to know from science class, so if you don't know it and if you haven't read it, you need to read it because I'm going to be covering it very, very quickly. The prenatal period has three phases. It's the germinal period, which is the first 2 weeks after conception, the embryonic period, which is the 3rd to the 8th weeks, and the fetal period, which is 9 weeks to birth. During the germinal stage, which is that 2-week period, a couple things happen. Conception occurs when the sperm cell combines with the egg. That's called a zygote. About 36 hours after conception is when the zygote starts to divide really, really fast. And it becomes a little ball of cells, and that ball of cells starts to move along the fallopian tube to the uterus. It's not until about 10 days that the ball of cells starts to become embedded in the wall of the uterus. That process is called implantation. Implantation takes about a week to complete, and if implantation fails, which is actually common, the pregnancy terminates. So think about that, you guys. There's like this, the germinal stage is like this tiny little 2-week window where, sure, things are happening, but if that ball of cells isn't implanted, then nothing's really going on. So when people freak out like, oh, I might be pregnant, and they take a pregnancy test and it's been 2 days, they might get a false positive because implantation often fails, which is why you usually have to wait to go into a doctor's office. They want to make sure that implantation actually happened in order to start discussing pregnancy with you. All right. A key feature of that stage is that the placenta starts to be formed. It has two important functions. It passes oxygen and nutrients from anything that's in the mother's system, so the mother's blood, onto the embryo or fetus, and then it also removes waste materials from the embryo or fetus. The embryonic stage, which is stage 2, this stage lasts from the end of the germinal stage until 2 months after conception. Now that little ball of cells is called an embryo. In this stage, all the major organs form. The embryo is super fragile. The organs form, but they don't function. The only thing that happens by the end of this stage is the heart begins to beat. So during essentially that 2-month period, you'll be able to actually hear a heartbeat, which is kind of a cool thing. At the end of this period, the embryo is about 1 inch long. So think about how tiny that little embryo is. All right. During this embryonic period, guys, it's important for you to understand that the fetus is very susceptible to toxins. Those toxins are called teratogens. Teratogens are anything in the environment that could be harmless or harmful to the fetus. So that could be certain foods that you're not supposed to eat while you're pregnant. It could also be any drug. That includes alcohol, nicotine, caffeine, anything like that that you're not supposed to really put in your body while you're pregnant. So it's really important to understand that poor nutrition, so not following the guidelines, things like that, all of that stuff goes directly to the embryo. So you have to be really careful with that. Also important to know that, guys, you're not off the hook. Drug use by the father can actually damage sperm. So alcohol, opiates, cocaine, lead, different gases and things like that that you can inhale, those are all known to damage your sperm. And remember, your sperm is one part of what's making this eventual baby. So it's important that you're taking care of yourselves too. All right, moving into the final stage then. If I can make that happen on my slide. All right, it's the fetal stage. So that's pretty much 2 months after conception until birth. About a month into this stage is when the sex organs begin to form. So that's around the time that if you want to find out what you're having, you can find that out. Bones and muscles, organ systems, all of those things. It's during about the 6 months that organs have formed and developed enough for the fetus to survive on its own if it needed to. Also, during the 6 month, the fetus is responsive to sound. So a lot of times partners like to talk to the baby while they're growing inside or whatever. It doesn't really matter if you do that prior to the 6 month mark because, again, they're not really responsive to sound. But it is important, actually, after that. The baby would be born, coming out, being more familiar with certain voices, which is kind of cool. All right. So some issues to think about, and then I might do a separate video for infancy and childhood, but some issues to think about. How should the criminal justice system handle mothers who abuse drugs or things like that during their pregnancy? Do you think that society should have any rules about that? So I put up some fun facts, just different states that consider substance abuse to be actually child abuse or grounds for civil commitment. So Wisconsin is one of the 17. So if you know someone or, it's your partner that's pregnant or whatever, and they're abusing drugs and they won't stop, you can actually go to the police about that. It's rare, but it does exist in Wisconsin, that you can actually do something about it. Other issues to discuss that would pertain to development during this time would be when life begins, genetic testing of fetuses for abnormalities, human cloning, and stem cell research. So those are some pretty hot topic issues that come up all before a child is even born. Okay, so you can see that developmental psychology is actually full of some really, really cool and important topics. That's all I have for you for this video. And we're going to transition into infancy and childhood, but I'm going to have us switch between videos here in a second.